Welcome to another edition of Hank Unplugged. I have the tremendous privilege today to bring you Robert Spencer. Robert is a hero of mine, quite frankly, and I think he ought to be a hero to you as well. The more you get to know about Robert, the more you realize that what he is doing is heroic, particularly in this cultural climate. He's the director of Jihad Watch. He's a Shillman Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. And think about this, he's led seminars on Islam as well as jihad for the FBI, the U.S. Central Command, the U.S. Army Command, the U.S. Army's Asymmetric Warfare Group, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, the Justice Department's Anti-Terrorism Advisory Council, as well as the U.S. intelligence community. He has made his mark on our culture in myriad ways. He has written so many fantastic books. He's the author of 19 books, and he's not slowing down anytime soon. And that includes the New York Times bestsellers, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam and the Crusades, and The Truth About Muhammad. He's got a forthcoming book out in December. It's titled The Palestinian Delusion, The Catastrophic History of the Middle East Peace Process. And the book that I'm really excited about, I don't think anybody's ever done anything this comprehensive before, The History of Jihad from Muhammad to ISIS. And Robert is, well, he's just a fearless warrior. He's willing to stand for truth no matter the cost, and he has paid a substantial cost. And so it's my honor to welcome Robert Spencer to Hank Unplugged. Hi, Robert.
Hank, thanks so much for your very kind words. It's great to be here.
You know, Robert, I mentioned a number of things about you, the kinds of seminars on Islam and jihad that you've done for the U.S. government. And I've been wondering whether or not it is true that the Council on American and Islamic Relations sent a series of letters to Robert Mueller to have you dropped as a counter-terror trainer.
Yes, that's right. They named me specifically. This was a few years back during the Obama administration. They were very upset that I was training FBI and military organizations and military groups. I would go to bases around the country as well as FBI offices. And the Council on American Islamic Relations didn't actually say in this letter to Robert Mueller that there was anything false in what I was saying, but just that it was so-called Islamophobic. And CAIR and 56 other Muslim and South Asian organizations wrote a letter after that to John Brennan, who was then in the Department of Homeland Security and later became the CIA chief under Obama, and again naming me, demanding that I be removed as a trainer. And Brennan immediately complied. And so it's been since 2011 that I've done any of that work. What they so objected to was this. What I would do was go and explain to the assembled group what was the mindset of the terrorists they were facing. That is, I would take them through the Quran and through the life of Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, so that they could get an understanding of what the motives and goals, perspective, worldview of the terrorists was. And that's what CAIR found so objectionable. What they really did not want the American personnel to know was the mindset of the people they were facing. They wanted the old adage of Sun Tzu, as old as the art of warfare itself, that you have to know the enemy. They wanted our American personnel not to avail themselves of that and not to know the enemy. And that's the situation that we're still in now. Most counterintelligence agents have no idea of the way that the people they're dealing with look at the world.
Yeah, and I think that when I call you courageous, you've taken stands not to be politically correct. You've done it because truth matters. And I suppose there's a sense in which our own personal health issues plays into that. You and I have talked about this personally, but I almost died twice this year. Once as a result of
I only did once.
Well, once in my case as a result of an appendectomy, which was discovered as a result of a PET scan. It had already perforated and the fluids were leaking into my abdomen.
Oh, my.
And because of the PET scan happening exactly when it did, I was able to get an emergency appendectomy, which saved my life. And then when I was in the hospital getting a transplant, I ended up unconscious. My son David walked into the room at just the right time. I was brought to ICU. I was unconscious, and my life was spared once more. I don't remember anything that happened while I was in ICU. But, these were tremendous times in a way, in the sense that God is not interested in healing us physically. He's interested in healing the whole of us. So I went through some real spiritual surgery. And during that time, for me personally, I lost any sense of pride. I had to have nurses bathe me. I had to be diapered. I came to an end of myself. And I think that's really healthy. And I tell people now that God gave me back my life. My life belongs to Him. It's always belonged to Him, but I have an acute sense of that now. Now, I'm sharing that because you have a similar story. You quite literally died, as far as everybody was concerned.
No heartbeat, no pulse, and they came and said to my wife, we'll help you with funeral arrangements and so on. But then it started up again, and even though I was unconscious for about 10 days, 12 days, I don't remember anything from this period myself. Ultimately, I woke up. I remember very distinctly waking up from this on May 8th and starting to realize what had happened. But one thing I wanted to address most of all in discussing this, Hank, is that you noted that twice it was just a matter of timing, of coincidence, one would say, or of divine providence, believers would say, that you were saved from death. And the same thing happened with me, actually. All through April, I had suffered from pneumonia, and I went back to the doctor, and he said, if you keep on feeling bad, then next time you should not come to see me, you should go to the emergency room. And so I actually don't remember going to the emergency room, but I was told later that if I had gone any earlier, they would not have detected anything amiss. But if I'd waited any longer, then I wouldn't have survived. And happened to just get there at the right time.
So how does that impact what you do today, or how you look at, so many people are trying to climb the ladder with the sales of books and with notoriety. How do you look at your life after you almost slipped into eternity?
It does change one's perspective a great deal, Hank, and I can certainly agree with you on that. Certainly I like selling books. Obviously, I'm not doing all this so that I could just be shouting into the void. I'm hoping that people will notice what I'm writing and recognize its implications and work to affect public policy in various ways as a result. But at the same time, I recognize, and of course I always did, but it comes home to you in a greater degree after this kind of thing happens, that everything is in the hands of God, and that He will decide what course our nation takes and what course the world takes. And it's much more important to be doing His will than it is to be influential or famous or powerful or anything of the kind. These things are illusory ultimately because they pass so quickly and they are so contingent upon so many different things. You can't name 5 famous people from 100 years ago, and neither can I. At least I think you can't. But the point is that these things are all passing. And what matters, what endures, is what does not pass. and that's what we have to be mindful of.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. By the way, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank you for graciously writing the foreword to my own book, Muslim, What You Need to Know About the World's Fastest Growing Religion. I thought, if I could get Robert Spencer, I don't know of anybody else that knows more about this subject than Robert Spencer, if I could get him to write the foreword to this book, I think it would be tremendous. And you not only wrote the foreword, but it was one of the most generous forewords imaginable.
Well, it was a terrific book.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming from you, Robert, I don't know what to say. Thank you.
Thank you. It was really, seriously, I was very impressed, and I thought this is just the kind of thing that's going to reach people who need to see it and who are likely not to be open to some of the other approaches coming from me as well as from others, and that you're the man to tell them, and you're telling them in the way that they can hear. And so more power to you.
Thank you, Robert. And we sort of alluded to this, but I want to have you touch on the fact that we live today in the shadow of the Bible. We no longer live in its pages. And as a result, you mentioned we can't name people from the past, fame and fortune, so fleeting. But we also know far too little about how Christians unlocked the secrets of the universe during the scientific revolution, how they created the university systems, hospitals, modern medicine, how they ended slavery, the literary standards that we enjoy today, all have their roots in Christ and Christianity. And I think far too few people are aware of that. They're still benefiting from a Christian worldview in a post-Christian Western civilization, but they don't even know it because they're like the fish in water. They're unaware of the water that they swim in.
Right, and the farther we get away from Christianity as a culture, the more it will dawn on them. But by then it'll be too late. It's the motion away from the faith is not something that's going to be good for our society or for any of the individuals in it. And you're absolutely right. I think that this is something that needs to be much more widely known and disseminated. I know there's some books that have been written about it. Rodney Stark has written some good books about the contribution of Christianity to civilization as a whole. I myself wrote a book many years ago now, 2007 actually, which is funny to say it was 12 years ago, Religion of Peace, Why Christianity Is and Islam Isn't, in which I compare in terms of some of the things that you mentioned, slavery and scientific innovation and so on. I compare Christianity and Islam and show why Christianity actually made these contributions to civilization in a way that Islam did not and never could have done. But most people have no idea whatsoever. You're absolutely right. And they are being taught things that are absolutely false, that Christianity has been a baneful influence on global civilization and world history, and that Islam has been a positive influence. It's really a complete inversion of reality.
I want to start at the very beginning, and that is the founder of Christianity contrasted with the founder of Islam. Today, so often we forget about Muhammad's history, and when we compare Muhammad to the crystal Christ, the paragon of virtue, without whom we would have no Western civilization, the comparison is a stark reality. Maybe you can elucidate that for those listening in.
Yeah, it's very important, Hank. It's very important in the first place to emphasize why this matters, and that is that in Islam, the Quran in chapter 33, verse 21 specifies that Muhammad is the excellent example of conduct. And so this is something that is understood in Islamic tradition and theology as being an absolute statement, that if he's the excellent example, that means that everything he does without exception is good, is righteous, and ought to be imitated by the believers. Now, the Christian also strives to emulate Christ in his life, but a lot of people don't realize that Muslims should try to imitate Muhammad, because they know that in Islam, Muhammad is just a prophet and not the God incarnate or anything of the kind, and so they don't realize that they have this understanding that they have to imitate him, but it is very much central in Islam. And so then you see that the Lord said, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, and so on, and that by contrast, Muhammad cursed his enemies, mandated the assassination of people who had insulted him, was a warlord who led armies in battle, aggressive armies that were attacking peaceful people. He was somebody of voracious lust with 13 to 15 wives, depending on which count one credits, and other sex slaves and so on. He was a pedophile with a 9-year-old wife, 6 years old when they were married, and then 9 years old when he consummated the marriage, it is said, but really that amounts to rape because she was not able to consent in an adult manner at the age of 9. And so on and on. These things are completely opposite to the love, to the justice, to the charity, to the humility, to the fidelity, to all these things that Jesus exhorts Christians to embody.
What do you make of what's going on today in Turkey?
In Turkey, it's a variety of things. For one thing, the central thing that's happening in Turkey is that the president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, wants to restore the Ottoman Caliphate. The Ottoman Empire, as I show in the history of Jihad, was the last and arguably the greatest of the Islamic Caliphates, the Islamic empires that were ruled by a caliph. The word caliph means successor, and the caliphates were considered to have succeeded the Islamic state that was set up by Muhammad himself, and the caliphs were the successors of Muhammad. The Ottoman Caliphate was abolished in 1924 by the secular Turkish government that had arisen when the Ottoman Empire fell after World War I. And Erdogan wants to bring it back. Not only does he want to bring it back in Turkey, but he wants to bring it back in all the areas that were once part of the Ottoman Empire and that are now independent states of their own. That is Greece, Syria, Lebanon. It would also include Egypt, Israel, other states, all the states of Eastern Europe. He's actually said as much, that he wants to reconquer the land that comprised the Ottoman Empire. And so right now, he has for years been fighting against the Kurds, and the Kurds are a people who were promised a state after World War I. They were never given that state. They've never actually had an independent state, but they've always been a distinct ethnicity in Syria, Iraq, and Iran, and in Turkey, and there's long been a movement to unite Kurds in those four countries into an independent Kurdistan. Erdogan, of course, is fighting against that because it goes directly against his own aspirations. And so now he's moving against the Kurds in northern Syria, hoping to incorporate that land into Turkey and to mitigate the Kurdish threat. And these things we can stand against and deplore. At the same time, the separate question of whether American forces need to be involved in this or should be involved in this, well, that's a whole other matter.
What do you make of the influence peddling that Turkey has within the American government? I watched a documentary on this, Architects of Denial. I saw a movie as well, The Promise. Both of them are very, very well done, and they point out that there's a tremendous amount of amnesia on the part of the American populace, that we, by and large, don't even remember something that happened a short time ago from 1917 to 1923, the Armenian genocide, for example. And what Hitler said when he said that the collective amnesia of people would cause them to forget what he was about to do in Poland because they'd already forgotten what had been done to the Armenians.
Yeah, that's right. That's very important. This is one of the reasons why I wrote the history of jihad, in fact, that the history of jihad is not known. The bloody career trajectory of the Ottoman Empire is not known, and the influence that the Armenian genocide, in which 1.5 million Armenians and 1 million Greeks and 250,000 Assyrians were killed, people don't realize that that had an influence on Hitler and so on. The Turks are peddling influence in Washington. They do have a great amount of that influence. Erdogan has taken up the slack where the Saudis have left off. The Saudis are trying to modernize, not to the extent that they are really going against Islamic law in any meaningful way, but they have greatly eased back on their attempts to spread Islam in the United States, their financing of mosques, and so on. And Turkey has taken up the slack. And at the same time, Turkey is trying to buy off as many politicians as it can so that it always receives favorable treatment in this regard. And so this is a matter of grave concern. Erdogan is not ultimately a friend of the United States. Turkey should, in a perfect world, be removed from NATO and not allowed to enter the European Union. The Turkish regime is one that represents a recrudescence of an ancient enemy of the West. But in Washington nowadays, if you say that, you're just accused of Islamophobia.
Talk about Islamophobia. You've used that word a number of times. I mean, if you look at it denotatively, I don't think you would fit the description of Islamophobia.
Yeah, it's a tactic. It's a tool. Islamophobia is a charge that somebody has an irrational bigotry or hatred of Muslims. And ever since 2001, ever since 9/11, it's been wielded against those who analyze in an honest manner the motives and goals of the jihad terrorists. So I was kind of stunned, really, when it was first used on me, and I thought it was absurd. And I kind of assumed, in a naive manner, that Americans were not going to fall for this, that nobody was going to fall for and accept the idea that to try to resist jihad mass murder and the killing of innocent civilians and the Sharia-mandated oppression of women and other groups would somehow constitute bigotry. And I thought, that's the most absurd tactic I've ever heard in my life. But it's worked wonderfully, really. Not only has Islamophobia become a part of the American lexicon and is taken for granted as being a genuine phenomenon, but also the people who speak honestly about the nature and magnitude of the jihad threat and about its roots in Islamic texts and teachings that exhort violence and warfare against non-Muslims and their subjugation under the rule of Islamic law. Those people have, without any exception, been demonized, stigmatized, marginalized to the extent that they're considered to be on par with the Ku Klux Klan or neo-Nazis. And I encounter this every time I'm invited to speak. Just last week, I was up in New Hampshire to speak for the Sullivan County, New Hampshire Republican Party. And the Democrats, the chairman of the New Hampshire Party was in a newspaper up there saying that I was an anti-Muslim Islamophobe and so on. And the state senator was saying that I did not represent the inclusive, diverse values of Sullivan County, New Hampshire. Anyway, they got 2 venues to cancel me. And it's because they're afraid, these venues, they get to be afraid of protests, and they get to be afraid of the stigma of forever after the leftists in the area saying you allowed these wicked right-wingers to have their meeting in your place. And so they fold because they don't want trouble. They just are running a business. I understand that, but I think that this is a time when we have to have a little bit more courage as a society and stand up and say, wait a minute, this is a massive sleight of hand that you were trying to perpetrate on the American people. This is not an honest discourse. There is nothing racist or bigoted or hateful about opposing the indiscriminate killings of non-Muslims solely because they are non-Muslims, and the sanction of wife-beating and polygamy and sex slavery and so on that are mandated in Islamic law. To oppose those things is just the opposite of bigoted and hateful.
But they're basically saying, Robert, look, Muhammad was a man of his time. Yeah, that's the way people acted back then, but Islam has now reformed itself. What do you say to that?
Well, here we go. It's just what I was saying before, that Islam says, the Quran, which is the highest authority in Islam, says that Muhammad is the excellent example. And so if Muhammad did it, there's no reforming that. There's no reforming the Quran either, for that matter, because Allah says in the Quran in chapter 5, verse 3, "This day I have perfected your religion for you." This is the great obstacle that Islamic reformers have faced throughout history. They get charged with heresy on the grounds that they are taking what is perfect and rendering it imperfect. And so they have been killed as heretics. Even recently, in 1985, which is recently in me, there was a man, Mahmoud Mohammed Taha, in Sudan, who started to teach that the peaceful verses of the Quran should supersede the violent ones, when standard Islamic theology holds just the opposite, that the violent verses supersede the peaceful ones. And he was executed by the Sudanese government as a heretic. So the idea that Islam has reformed or rejected the violence that is exhorted in the Quran is contradicted in the first place by the evidence of our senses, by the fact that there have been 35,000 jihad terror attacks around the world since 9/11, and also by the facts of Sharia states, of Islamic states. Wherever there are nations that implement Islamic law, then we see that they have abominable human rights records, like Iran and Saudi Arabia and Somalia and Sudan and the rest of them. And also that they're quite belligerent and seem to be pursuing warfare against their enemies, against the neighboring countries that are not Muslim, solely because they are not Muslim, with Iran and Pakistan being the greatest cases in point of that.
How do you explain to people that there's no possibility of going into a place like Iraq or Afghanistan or any other Muslim territory and suddenly erecting a democracy there? Because in Islam, Sharia is state and state is Sharia, and therefore you can't have separation between church and state.
Yes, that's right, Hank. And it's like, Sharia is like the Ten Commandments. It's divine law. If I said to you, hey, let's change some of those commandments, they're outdated. Let's have some new commandments and throw a few of them out. You would say that's absurd. The Ten Commandments are ordained by God. They're immutable. And that's how Islamic theology regards Islamic law, Sharia. The thing about it is that Sharia, unlike the Ten Commandments, is not just a set of guidelines to pattern one's behavior. It's a massive set of rules for every aspect of human behavior. And so instead of just giving you general principles, you have very specific instructions for everything that you can conceive of doing as a human being. And so when you talk about society and how it ought to be governed, and how the society ought to be ordered, then Sharia has very specific provisions for that. And if you are a pious and knowledgeable and believing Muslim, then you're going to think that those provisions come from God and are not negotiable any more than a Christian would think the Ten Commandments are negotiable. So the Americans come in and say, we're going to set up a government where you can vote for what kind of laws you want to have, or you vote for elected officials who will draw up a constitution. That's absolutely unwelcome. It's anathema to them because they are conditioned to the idea that Islamic law gives you all of that. You don't vote on it any more than we vote on the Ten Commandments. It is what it is. You just have to accept and implement it.
And then you think about the Quran itself, and I thought it might be good to dig into that a little bit because there's a sense in which there are two Qurans. There's the surahs that have to do with Mecca and the surahs that have to do with Medina. There's the surahs that have to do with Muhammad as an itinerant preacher and Muhammad as a ruthless warlord. And so in a sense, the Muslims have this advantage, at least for the uninformed, to point to all of these verses that sound very accommodating. And on the other hand, there are so many that counter that, and yet from a Muslim perspective, the Quran is, and you alluded to this, it's uncreated, it's unalterable, it's without error, it has ethics beyond question, it's eloquent, and therefore you got to accept it, and yet it's self-contradictory.
Yes, it's self-contradictory, but the key out of the contradiction as far as Islamic theologians are concerned is in chapter 2, verse 106, where it says, whenever we, with Allah, that's Allah speaking and using the royal we, whenever we abrogate or cause to be forgotten a passage, we will supply one that is just as good or better. And that is, if one considers Islam from a non-Muslim standpoint, that is the dodge of a very clever false prophet who understands that he's going to contradict himself in the course of things. And so he's giving himself an excuse to do so, that Allah has abrogated the previous command and replaced it with one that's better. And so in Islamic theology, it's very simple. If you have a command that comes later, then it supersedes the one that comes earlier, and it's abrogated. Now, a lot of people don't understand the concept of abrogation, and they think that it means that the earlier command is entirely gone. It isn't. It will be in effect if the conditions in which it was first given reappear, but then it will always be superseded later. And the specific example of that is most pertinent for us today is precisely the fact that the Quran taught coexistence, if not mutual respect, with unbelievers in the first part, in the Meccan part, and then warfare against unbelievers in the Medinan part. You find that Muslim spokesmen in the West, although this is changing now, but for many years after 9/11, it was routine that they would quote the Meccan passages, the peaceful passages, and it wasn't solely that they were being deceptive. They would, of course, never mention that these were abrogated. But the fact is that those passages apply in Islamic theology when Muslims are a weak group. When the Quran in chapter 109 says, you have your religion and we have ours, and I will not worship what you worship and you will not worship what I worship, and so on. It is something that was said when the Muslims were weak and the non-Muslims were strong. And the Muslims were actually asking for tolerance in that. They weren't saying they were going to tolerate anybody else. They were asking for tolerance for themselves. And so when Muslims are in a non-Muslim society and constitute a weak minority, then they preach tolerance. And what they want is tolerance for themselves. But when they become a majority or even a significantly large minority within that society, then they start to try to transform it by applying Sharia and demanding that Sharia provisions be accepted by non-Muslims.
That transformation is now taking place in Europe on a large scale. And I remember the words of Muammar Gaddafi, who was the late Libyan leader, who said, I'm paraphrasing, but why fly airplanes into buildings when, with a little patience, those buildings will be ours? And he was talking about demographics. The Muslims are proliferating rapidly, not only through immigration into European territories, but also through proliferation simply by birth rate. The native populations are dying out, not enough births to keep up with the deaths, and the Muslims are really becoming a majority in many ways within Europe.
That's quite right. They probably will be a majority in several European countries by the end of this century. And this is a tactic. Houari Boumediene, the president of Algeria in the 1970s, actually said, we will conquer Europe by the wombs of our women. And this is what's happening now. Also, I ran recently a series of surveys of mosques by a former intelligence agent, Dave Gabatz, who has gone around to mosques all around the United States and examined the literature that they have available and other related matters, and he wrote a series of reports about what was in those mosques. And he says in one of his reports about mosques in Georgia that the local imam said that there's no need for us to mount jihad terror attacks in the United States these days because we are winning without them. And that goes back to the whole Islamophobia tactic as well as to the demographic jihad.
Now, we talk about that taking place within Europe, but it's now taking place within America as well. What do you make of so many members of Congress now who have risen to power? They're Islamic, and they're unabashedly anti-Semitic in many cases.
Well, see, this is all part of the normalization of Islamic attitudes in the United States. And this is one of the reasons why there was such a concerted effort to put elected officials who were Muslim into Congress. And you have Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, the Muslim congresswomen, who are much more vocal and visible than the Muslim congressman Andre Carson. And they're celebrated by feminists and by the left as being symbols of America's diversity and its openness to the other and so on. And meanwhile, they are viciously anti-Semitic. They openly associate with supporters of jihad terror groups and with apologists for those jihad terror groups. And this has already had a very negative effect on the American public discourse. I don't think that it's at all a coincidence that anti-Semitic incidents in New York City and elsewhere have risen to alarming levels we have not seen before in the United States. And this is happening. This is being blamed on Donald Trump, oddly enough, the most pro-Israel president since the State of Israel has existed. But in reality, it is going along with the rapid acceptance of anti-Semitism on the left and the normalization of anti-Semitic discourse. And to say that to have some far-left politician or Antifa leader or something say anti-Semitic things, that's one thing. But to have it coming from the halls of Congress, that's quite another. And it has a tremendous influence, a deleterious influence.
What do you make of this story about Ilhan Omar marrying her own brother? Is that something that you take seriously?
Oh, I think that's abundantly established. David Steinberg, who I've known for years and is an indefatigable and careful investigative reporter, he has documented it by examining marriage records, Facebook posts from Ilhan Omar herself, the photographs of her brother versus the photographs of her husband, various other kinds of records, and it seems definitive. It doesn't seem to have been a case of incest, but rather a case of immigration fraud, that she was manipulating the system in order to gain American citizenship for her brother. That's what it seems to have been all about.
You think that'll ever come to a head?
It's already starting to get notice in the mainstream press. The Star Tribune, the Minneapolis paper that is Ilhan Omar's home district paper, covered for her for years, and not only would not publish any of Steinberg's evidence, but disparaged it as a conspiracy theory and so on. Recently, the chorus of disapproval became too great for them to continue to ignore the story. And so the Star Tribune actually published stories saying that there were some questions about her marital record. Not the whole story, but still much more than they had done before. And so that's a good sign. Whether that will continue and culminate in anything, I think, is unfortunately unlikely because the district that Ilhan Omar comes from is one with a massive Somali Muslim migrant population, and there really isn't anything that she can do that would alienate them from her. They know that she represents their interests in Washington, and so I think she can be in Congress as long as she wants.
Another area that has tremendous influence from an Islamic standpoint is Michigan, particularly Dearborn, Michigan. And you mentioned Rashida Tlaib. She is, of course, not from Dearborn. She's a U.S. representative to the 13th Congressional District. But the impact that Islam has had in Michigan is quite dramatic.
Yes, certainly. And it indicates what happens? That you have people come, and as per the Quran, as we discussed before, they ask for tolerance. And then once they get the tolerance, then they start to make demands. And I think that a primary example of that is what happened in Hamtramck, Michigan, which is right next to Dearborn, and which became the first area of the United States to implement the Islamic call to prayer over loudspeakers. And it booms out over the whole town. Now, the thing about that I think was most disquieting is the fact that the city council years ago in Hamtramck was meeting, and they were going to decide whether or not they were going to amend the noise ordinance in Hamtramck so as to allow the blasting of the call to prayer over loudspeakers. And a Muslim leader in Hamtramck was actually quoted as saying in the local paper at that time that it didn't really matter which way the city council voted, they were going to do it anyway. And I thought, well, that's chilling, but it's also quite revealing that they don't really have any respect for and I'm just talking about these people in Hamtramck, but I don't think that they're alone either. But they didn't have any respect for the local officials or the local laws. They were going to do what they wanted to do and pretty much dare the local authorities to come after them, which those authorities almost certainly would not have done because they would have thought it to be Islamophobic to stand against them. And so this is what was the outcome of the tolerance that was extended to the Muslim community by the people in Hamtramck, that suddenly they end up getting dictated to by the people whom they welcomed.
Why is it that the radical left seems to love Islam and despise Christianity, even at the cost of its own self-destruction?
You know, Hank, I think the answer to that lies in the old principle, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that what we see in the leftist Islamic alliance is the working out of, is the revelation, really, that the real agenda of leftist groups is not what they say it is. It is not really women's rights or rights for homosexuals or anything of that kind. What it really is an attempt to destroy the West, destroy the United States, and destroy anybody who is standing in their way to attain their goals of a globalist, socialist, universalist economy and polity. And that means that they just use feminism and the rest of it as props. But they are happy to ally with Islam, even though it is quintessentially anti-feminist, because they realize that here in Islam they have something that has been set against the Western world and the Christian world for 1,400 years. And so what better enemy of my enemy is that? This is a group that's been wanting to destroy what they want to destroy for far longer than they've been around.
I want to get into your book, The History of Jihad, From Muhammad to ISIS, which is a fantastic read. The amount of work that you did in putting that book together is just monumental. But look, I want you to first comment on the ascendancy of a liberalism which welcomes Muslims as the best of all neighbors, even though, as Benjamin Weicker has noted, everything about Islam is diametrically opposed to secular liberalism. And the reason I want to tie this into your book is that this isn't new. It's been part and parcel of modern European atheism from the late Middle Ages on. Maybe you would say even before that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very strange thing, but it actually arose in the Reformation. And when Martin Luther was criticizing the Pope, he contrasted the Catholic Church unfavorably with Islam and said that the Muslims treated the Christians with tolerance and it was a religion of peace and all this nonsense that we hear so often today. He was one of the first to say it. And it was really, I don't think that Martin Luther had a deep understanding of Islam or wanted to be an Islamic apologist. He was just looking around for any weapon he could use in the polemics he was involved in against the Catholic Church. But this kind of delusion it proved to be powerful, and it ended up being used in other contexts as well. In the 1850s, the British Empire, for reasons of its own, wanted to conclude an alliance with the Ottoman Empire. But the Ottoman Empire had a very bad reputation in Britain because in those days, historical memories were not so short as they are today. And many, many British people knew that the Ottoman Empire had been an enemy of the West and hence of the British for centuries. And so they were not in favor of this proposed alliance. And so the British revived Luther's old canards about Islam being peaceful and treating the Christians wonderfully, and spread them in those days for their own purposes. And so this has been something that has been a persistent myth in the West, used by people to foster their own internecine conflicts, foster their own side in those internecine conflicts in the West.
In the history of jihad, again, the title of your book, you have to distinguish between just war theory as delineated by centuries of Christian theology and jihad as mandated by Sharia.
Yes, this is very important that people realize, and this is one of the reasons why I wrote the book, as a matter of fact. The history of jihad is the history of the working out of a principle in Islamic theology, which calls for warfare against unbelievers. It is a responsibility of the Muslim community to wage war against, conquer, and subjugate unbelievers. That is written in the Quran, written in Islamic theology, and as I show in the book, it played out in 1400 years of Islamic history. And without any exception, without any pause, without any reformation, without any reconsideration, it was absolutely a constant. Just war theory in Christianity is very different. It doesn't mandate warfare against anyone. It doesn't call for any kind of continuous warfare or conquest. It's only a justification for defensive warfare in certain very straitened circumstances. And it delineates those circumstances quite specifically so as to allow for the possibility that a war might be fought but not be considered to be completely unjustified or sinful in all cases. This is worlds apart from the aggressive, expansionist doctrine of jihad.
In that vein, put the Crusades into perspective. You know, this is an old canard that's brought up over and over again, ad nauseum, ad infinitum, and most people that mention Crusades don't know how many Crusades there were, don't know what the history of the Crusades were, but they bring it up, and it is a big, big black mark, black eye on the face of Christianity. And yet, if you look at the history of the Crusades, you find that this has to do with victims of jihad striking back at their oppressors.
Yeah, it's kind of absurd, Hank, but of course there's so much that is absurd about our age. Right after 9/11, Bill Clinton actually invoked the Crusades as explaining what had happened and was saying that the source of the antagonism between the West and the Islamic world was this supposedly gratuitous attack by Christians on peaceful Muslims. And that's how most people think of the Crusades, unfortunately, to a tremendous degree, because that's how they're taught to our own children in our own schools. And this is a terrible thing, really, that children are being brought up, a whole generation, probably more, of children all over the West. They have been taught that the Western world is uniquely evil and is responsible for the conflicts in the world. And so the Crusades, in reality, were a late and small-scale defensive reaction against 450 years of Islamic jihad activity that had overwhelmed over half of Christendom before any crusade was ever contemplated. I've got extensive information about the Crusades in the book, and I show that the Muslims began to attack Christian areas in the 630s. The first crusade was called in 1095. So that's over 450 years, where the Muslims were conquering and destroying ancient Christian communities subjugating them as inferiors under the rule of Islamic law and making life so onerous for those Christians that ultimately they left the area or they converted to Islam, such that ancient Christian communities that were renowned and still are in Christian history are completely gone, like North Africa, from which St. Augustine and St. Cyprian come, and Syria, where there's the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, which is now the Umayyad Mosque, and all of Christianity, Nestorian Christianity, that once spread all the way to China, all the way across Central Asia. These Christian communities have been completely destroyed by Islamic Jihad. In 1095, Pope Urban II did not say, hey, we're going to win all that back and fight against Islam. That was not in the slightest what his program was. It's never been anybody's program, and nor am I calling for it. But what he said was that the pilgrims in the Holy Land, Christians who made pilgrimages to Jerusalem, were being attacked, were being kidnapped, enslaved, sometimes even killed by Muslims, and that consequently, in order to protect them, he was calling for a crusade. He was calling for the Christian armies, Christians from Europe, to go into the Middle East and reconquer just a small bit of the territory that Muslims had conquered in order to make the area safe for Christian pilgrims. That's all it was. The Christian territories in the Middle East that were conquered in the Crusades lasted for 200 years. And then in the year 1291, 196 years after the First Crusade was called, the last of them was conquered by the Muslims, and that was it. There were several other crusades attempted after that all failed, and that's the whole of the Crusades. So to say that the Crusades are the beginning of the antagonism between the West and Islam is to be completely ignorant of history or determined to obfuscate it.
And right now we have a similar situation in the Levant. We have mass genocide against Christians, and that is squarely in the blind spot of the West. I try to bring that up as often as I can because I can't imagine why this is not communicated in the pulpits of our churches, why this is not something that is on the forefront of our consciousness.
Well, I can tell you why, because the churches have completely, for the most part, bought into the idea that it's wrong, that they have to pursue dialogue with the Muslims and that they need to emphasize how Islam is a religion of peace and so on. And, of course, I was in the Catholic Church for quite a few years, and when I was invited to speak at Catholic churches, then I was usually canceled by the local bishop, who would say how it would harm the dialogue they were having with the Muslims if I were to speak. And one bitterly ironic incident of this was when I was invited to speak in Worcester, Massachusetts, and the local Roman Catholic bishop, Robert McManus, actually issued a statement saying exactly that the dialogue, the wonderful dialogue they were having in Massachusetts with the Muslim community would be hurt. Now, what I was supposed to speak about was Christian persecution, and McManus actually acknowledged that and said that we can't talk about the persecution of Christians because that would hurt our dialogue. And I thought, well, what good is the dialogue if it doesn't prevent the Christians from being hurt? What good is your dialogue if it does not keep this persecution from happening? But that's just that's not on their radar. This is not a consideration that they have. And of course, it's not just the Catholic Church. It's churches of all kinds have completely bought into the idea that it's somehow wrong to discuss the crimes against humanity that are committed in the name of Islam and in accord with its teaching, and wrong to point out how Islamic texts mandate warfare against unbelievers. All these things hurt the dialogue, which hasn't actually solved anything, but everybody assumes that it has or someday will.
Sort out fact from fiction with respect to Pope Francis as a defender of Islam, the Quran, the Sharia death penalty for blaspheming, and so forth.
Pope Francis has been responsible to a tremendous degree for the atmosphere I was just outlining. He actually came into the papacy determined to reverse a lot of what had been done by Pope Benedict XVI. And one of the things that had been done by Pope Benedict XVI was regarded as an unmitigated error by Pope Francis. Benedict had actually criticized the killing of Christians in a cathedral in Egypt some years back. It was Christmas, I believe, or New Year's, and the cathedral was packed, and Islamic jihadis went into the cathedral and shot quite a large number of people. And Benedict XVI called upon Muslim leaders to repudiate this and called it what it was, as a terrible crime. The Grand Sheikh of Al-Azhar being the institution in Cairo, which is the foremost educational institution in the Islamic world, and pretty much the most respected institution in Sunni Islam, was where Barack Obama spoke when he made his famous outreach speech to the Islamic world in 2009. The Grand Sheikh of Al-Azhar was furious, and he said to Pope Benedict, you have no right to interfere in the internal affairs of Egypt, and we're going to break off the dialogue with the Roman Catholic Church as a result of your Islamophobia. And he did. And instead of crawling back, he said, you have to apologize, and you have to affirm that Islam is a religion of peace if we're going to have this dialogue. And Benedict did not crawl back, as I say, but he stood firm because, after all, what he had said was true and necessary. But Pope Francis, when he came in, he did exactly what the Grand Sheikh of Al-Azhar had said to do. He apologized. He affirmed that Islam is a religion of peace. He issued an outrageously false statement saying, authentic Islam and the proper reading of the Quran reject every form of violence, which is just about as wrong as it can possibly be, but has essentially become, because of the nature of the papacy and the understanding of authority in the Catholic Church, it's essentially become the policy of the entire Catholic Church. They're committed to this falsehood, which is not just a falsehood, but a very, very dangerous falsehood that condemns Christians in the Middle East and elsewhere to be persecuted without anybody lifting a finger to help them. And Pope Francis has reestablished the dialogue. He and Al-Tlaib, the Grand Sheikh of Al-Azhar, signed a declaration in Dubai last year that rejects violence in the name of religion, and so you think that sounds good, but it rules out, of course, the possibility of anybody thinking that that violence might come from Islamic texts or teachings, and calls for more economic aid on the part of the West to Muslim countries and so on, as if that's the reason why jihad terrorism is happening.
Play amateur psychologist for a moment. I mean, try to get in the head of Pope Francis or even George Bush, who called Islam a religion of peace and tolerance, or Barack Obama, who says he, as a historian, knows the history of Islam like the back of his hand. And yet all of these people either are ignorant or willfully complicit. What is it?
Well, I think that with Obama, he probably is willfully complicit because he did spend several years of his childhood in Indonesia, and he had Islamic education. He talks about getting in trouble for making faces in Quran class. Incidentally, the Christian children in Indonesia did not go to Quran class, so it's clear that he was classified as a Muslim at that time, even though it became a scandal and a terrible thing that his opponents were doing, a sign of Islamophobia and racism, when they suggested that he had been raised a Muslim. But in any case, the thing about Obama is that he does seem to know, or should know, what Islam teaches. And so I think that he was thinking that if he said these polite falsehoods, that it would pacify the situation and help to bring peace between the West and the Islamic world. But, the left has a lot of things like this, that they think that if they say it, it will become true. And so if they say, for example, that there is no threat from illegal immigrants, then illegal immigrants won't commit any crimes. And so it's the same kind of thing with Obama, I think, that he thought that if he said Islam is a religion of peace, then Muslims would start to be peaceful. George W. Bush, on the other hand, and Pope Francis, I think they've just been played for fools by Sharpies. George W. Bush, of course, on September 17th, 2001, stood in the mosque in Washington, D.C., and said Islam is peace, and warned Americans against being mean to Muslims and mistreating women wearing hijabs, which was not happening in the United States at that time or any other. But he spent a great deal of his address, this has been forgotten, he spent a great deal of his address warning against that, as if Muslims were being rampantly targeted by racist redneck yahoos all over the country. It was kind of insulting, really, to patriotic Americans who had not done that. But in any case, Bush was standing in front of Nihad Awad of the Council on American Islamic Relations, which was and is a lobbying group for Hamas in the United States, linked to the Muslim Brotherhood. He was also standing with Abdurrahman al-Amoudi, who was the head of the American Muslim Council, which at that time was the most prominent moderate Muslim organization in the United States, extraordinarily influential in Washington. And al-Amoudi is now serving time. He's in prison for raising money for al-Qaeda. And so he was not really a moderate then or ever, but these are the people who had Bush's ear, and they were able to get it. We were talking about Erdogan buying influence before, and these people have certainly bought a great deal of influence and been able to, through manipulation, gain a great deal of influence in the United States government then, and even more so now, in one way by claiming victim status and claiming that there was widespread Islamophobia and hatred against Muslims in the United States. And so the American officials had to work with them to make sure that that did not happen, and so on. And they fooled him. They did it very well, and he issued the statement that they wanted. I don't know so much who the Pope has been talking to. I know that there are some very prominent Catholic theologians who have great reputations, who insist that Islam is peaceful. I remember my own bishop, when I was a Catholic, the Melkite Greek Catholic Bishop Nicholas Samra, the Melkite Greek Catholic Bishop of the United States, telling me with a straight face that he had studied Islam from the leading Catholic authority on Islam in the world, whose name he would not give me, and he told me that he had told him that at its core, Islam is actually a religion of peace. And so this is the kind of thing that Catholic leaders are being taught, and they don't take the trouble to learn. Samra, as a matter of fact, being the bishop of a church that is primarily Lebanese and Syrian, he has plenty of people who could tell him the truth and would tell him the truth, but he's not disposed to pay any attention to such people. It would be Islamophobic, and I suspect that's much the same with Pope Francis.
By the way, the book History of Jihad, From Mohammed to ISIS, must-reading, available for those who support the ministry of the Christian Research Institute. If you support us, we'll be happy to send the book out to you. Our address, Box 8500, Charlotte, North Carolina, zip code 28271. You can also find the book on the web at equip.org or call our resource consultants at 888-7000 and the letters CRI. In the book, The History of Jihad, you talk about the golden age of Spain, or I should say the supposed golden age of Spain, or the myth of the Andalusian paradise. We hear so many politicians talking about this. Without Islam, we wouldn't have mathematics. Without Islam, we would not have the kinds of breakthroughs in technology that we are privileged with today. This is complete backward thinking. We started out talking about how Christ and Christianity unlocked the secrets of the universe. It was Christians who were on the forefront of ending slavery. All of that is the inverse with Islam, and there was no golden age in Spain. In fact, as always, it was always shahada, subjugation, or sword. It was always that triple threat.
Always, Hank, absolutely. And we have to understand that these false claims are made for a very specific purpose. The idea that Spain was some tolerant multicultural paradise where Jews, Christians, and Muslims all live together in peace and harmony. That is a creation of people, or it is propagated by people who want to get Westerners, Americans, and Europeans to accept mass Muslim migration into their countries. And so they want them to be complacent and think there's nothing wrong with this mass migration. These people are peaceful and tolerant. They made a great civilization in Spain, and they will make together with us a great civilization where we are now. And so that's the goal of all that, to compel people to stop resisting the mass migration that we see now into these countries, including our own. And the reality, unfortunately, is nothing like that. The reality is that Islamic Spain was a terrible place for Christians and Jews to live. It was a center of the slave trade, as a matter of fact, in Islam, which went on far longer than the American slave trade. And it was a place where Christians lived a very precarious existence. They could be killed at any point solely for not being Muslim. Islamic law, of course, allows Christians to live as dhimmis, as the so-called protected people, denied basic rights as long as they live, but able to live as long as they accept their second-class status mandated by Islamic law. But many times, not just in Muslim Spain, but elsewhere, and certainly in Muslim Spain, Christians would sometimes be challenged to give their opinion of Muhammad. And if they said that they did not agree that Muhammad was a prophet, then they could be accused of blasphemy and killed on that basis or enslaved on that basis. And this was Muslim Spain. It was a place where there was harmony and peace between Muslims and non-Muslims only when the non-Muslims knew their place and accepted that they were second class, that they did not have the rights that Muslims have and would not have those rights at any point. It was rather like, only worse, but it was rather like the old Jim Crow South, where, sure, there was harmony and peace between the races as long as the blacks knew their place and accepted an inferior position. It's ironic that the left that prides itself on being opposed to racism and discrimination would have absolutely no interest in this phenomenon, since it is quintessentially discriminatory.
And I suppose this is hand in hand with the whole idea of so many people becoming a Muslim just to avoid paying the jizya or the poll tax.
Yes. As a matter of fact, that's where all the Christians went. A lot of people, they don't really think about it. They hear that Egypt was 99% Christian when the Arabs appeared in the 630s and 640s and began to conquer the place. And they hear that North Africa used to be a vibrant Christian community. And I suppose people don't really think about whatever happened to those Christians, or just assume that over time people converted to Islam because they succumbed to its appeal. There has never been a large-scale movement of people who have converted to Islam because they think Islam is wonderful. People have converted to Islam over the centuries because Islamic law has made it such that Muslims established a society in which it was so difficult to live as a Christian that ultimately many of the Christians converted. The Egypt, as I said, was 99% Christian, and now it's about 6 to 10% Christian. The other people in Egypt are the ex-Christians and their descendants. It's not as if all the rest of those Christians just left the country. They're still there. But under the weight of the system of dhimitude, they ultimately converted to Islam, because a convert to Islam would immediately be relieved of a substantial tax burden and not have to comply with a whole host of humiliating and discriminatory regulations. And many people over the centuries, unfortunately, they may have valued their faith, but ultimately the pressure became too great for them.
What is your take on the state of Islamic terrorism today? So many people are thinking that ISIS is under control. We don't hear as much about the terrorist attacks in America. We don't hear that much about what's going on in Europe. Give us your overall assessment of what's going on there.
I think that it's happening and people don't even realize. It's happening And what we have is a tremendous amount of ignorance because of the disinformation that we've been told. Most people would take for granted that, yes, there are a few Islamic terrorists here and there, but there are also Christian terrorists, and we have to be much more concerned about white supremacists than we have to be concerned about Islamic jihadis. Now, this is misinformation. This is false information that has been systematically fed to the American people. Ilhan Omar recently said it, and Don Lemon, the CNN anchor, recently said it, and other people have said it. It's been stated in numerous news stories that I've encountered over the last few years that the FBI has supposedly established that the right-wing terror threat or the white supremacist terror threat is actually much greater than the Islamic Jihad threat. And this is just thrown out as if it were fact now by people like Omar and Lemon, when what it's based on is a false, jimmied, falsified study that came out a few years ago that counted the number of people killed by white supremacists versus the number of people killed by Islamic jihadis in the United States. And it found that there were more people killed by white supremacists, and that therefore white supremacism was a greater threat. It all sounds great until you start looking at the details. And the details show that the study's completely falsified. For the one thing, it starts on September 12th, 2001, to count the casualties. Now, why would you start on September 12th, 2001? Why not January 1st, 2000 or January 1st, 2010? Why would you start on, of all dates, September 12th, 2001? That made it transparent and patently obvious that what they were doing was trying to minimize the number of people killed by Islamic jihadis. If they had gone one day back, then they would have many, many more people killed by Islamic jihadis than by white supremacists in the United States. Also, the studies did not take into account the fact that Islamic jihad is a global movement, and there are Islamic jihadis on all continents today except Antarctica, whereas there are not white supremacists in South America or Africa or Asia. It's a phenomenon in the United States, and a tiny one at that. And the idea that it is a greater threat can only come from discounting the global nature of Islamic jihad, as well as the foiled plots. At my website, Jihad Watch, I track foiled plots quite often. And there, practically every week or more frequently, there is somebody who was trying to mount a jihad terror attack in the United States, and he gets caught and arrested. You don't hear nearly as often that some white supremacist was trying to mount a terror attack and got caught and arrested, because there simply aren't that many. And so this is absolute falsehood that is being pushed on the American people, but the American people, for the most part, don't know that it's false, and they buy it. And so they end up thinking that there really isn't much of a threat, much of a problem. And if we have these new Somali communities in Lewiston, Maine, and Minneapolis and elsewhere, and massive increase in the Muslim population over the last few years, there's nothing really to be concerned about. Of course, there'll be a few criminals, but there always are in every population.
Talk about the Levant again for a moment. I mean, if you think about the major landmark, the foremost landmark, you think about the Dome of the Rock. I've spoken there, actually. But it's sort of giving this impression that Islam is the culmination of Judaism and Christianity. It is one of the three major Abrahamic religions. Muhammad is the climax of the prophets. That somehow or other you can make some happy peace between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. That Muhammad is just the latest of the prophets, but you can reconcile all of this in time and space in the modern world. That's absolutely false, but I don't know that anybody can explicate that better than you can.
Well, the Dome of the Rock in particular is a symbol of why all that is false, is a manifestation of why it's false. Because the Dome of the Rock, where is it? It's on the Temple Mount. Why is it on the Temple Mount? To show the victory of Islam and the superiority of Islam over Judaism. In the history of jihad, I chronicle I don't know, dozens, hundreds of stories of Hindu temples that are destroyed by Muslims and mosques built over the site in order to show the victory of Islam over Hinduism and the superiority of Islam to Hinduism. And it's the same thing in Christianity. When you were talking about great landmarks, the greatest church in the Christian world until 1453, for 1,000 years, was the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. And it was the center of the Orthodox Church, and it was the grandest church in all of Christendom. There was nothing in Rome in the early part of those centuries, in those early centuries, there was nothing in Rome to match it. And the Muslims conquered it in 1453 and made it into a mosque. And then the secular Turks in the 1930s made it into a museum, but Islamic prayer is still acceptable there, whereas Christian prayer is strictly forbidden. Now, the idea of changing the Hagia Sophia and the Cathedral of John the Baptist and so many other Christian churches into mosques, and of building the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount, and of destroying all those Hindu temples and building mosques over them, the idea is all the same, and that is to show the victory of Islam and the superiority of Islam over the other religions. So that is just the opposite of the idea of coexistence and of those three Abrahamic faiths that accept monotheism existing peacefully and coexisting happily. If that were true, then the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque would never have been built on the Temple Mount. They would have been built somewhere else, anywhere else, because the Muslims would have had some appreciation for and understanding of the idea that they should be tolerant of Jews and Judaism. And it's the same thing in Constantinople. If Islam really were peaceful and tolerant, then the Hagia Sophia would be a church today. But the fact that it is not is an indication that Islam is not only aggressive and expansionist, but it adheres to a replacement theology that holds that Judaism and Christianity have their greatest fulfillment in Islam, and that true Christians and true Jews will actually become Muslim, and that's what is taught by the prophets of the Old Testament as well as by Jesus himself, that it's all Islam, that they were all Muslim prophets. It's a complete appropriation. Talk about cultural appropriation, a fashionable phrase these days. Islam is the king of cultural and religious appropriation. It declares itself to be the true and only true embodiment of the Abrahamic tradition.
Talk about the persecution that the Orthodox Church is facing in places like Turkey, particularly Istanbul, and also outside of Turkey, persecuting the Christians and co-opting a lot of the land of Christians, the great monuments and churches of Christians in places like Cyprus.
Well, it's all the same motion. In Cyprus, to take the second part first, the Turkish army occupied the northern part of the country in 1974, and it was a completely illegal action, an act of war, but nobody in the area was strong enough to drive the Turks out, and the United States was too involved with other matters, with the Cold War and so on, to want to alienate a NATO ally, which Turkey was and is. And so northern Cyprus became Turkish, and I tell you, I had a friend a few years back who was telling me, it was so great. I was able to get precious icons, beautiful icons, out of Cyprus in the 1970s for as low as $5, things that I would pay $2,000, $3,000 for now. And I was kind of appalled because I saw that he did not realize, and most Americans don't realize, that happened because the Turks destroyed and despoiled the churches and cleared out all traces of Christianity from the area they occupied. And this is a motion that is in line with what I've been discussing, the idea of the superiority and the ultimate victory of Islam. And so those things, the icons, precious icons from Cyprus, were available very cheaply because the Turks had no value, placed no value on all that. It was all manifestations of Jahiliyyah, the society of unbelievers. Any pre-Islamic culture is never given any value in Islam. In Turkey now, the tiny Christian community that still remains in Istanbul is under tremendous threat. The Ecumenical Patriarchate, the most important see in the Orthodox Church, is being asphyxiated. The Turkish government is pursuing policies that will ultimately destroy the Ecumenical Patriarchate if something doesn't change. For one thing, they mandate that the Ecumenical Patriarch has to be a citizen of Turkey, has to be born in Turkey. But they closed the only seminary, the only Orthodox seminary, the Halki Seminary. They closed it in 1971, and it's remained closed ever since, despite repeated entreaties from Orthodox all over the world. And so what they want to do, of course, is it's quite obvious that they want to bring about a situation where there cannot be an ecumenical patriarch in Istanbul because he cannot be anything but a Turkish citizen, and a Turkish citizen can't get an education that he would need to be the ecumenical patriarch in Turkey. And many of them, when they go away, they don't come back, which is understandable because it's not a very pleasant place to live for Christians. And nowadays, under the Erdogan regime and the re-Islamization of Turkey, the rollback of Kemalian secularism, you have many ancient sites of Christian churches that had been made into museums or just fallen into ruins being now reappropriated and made into mosques, increasing calls to make the Hagia Sophia into a mosque again, which I think is very likely if Erdogan retains power over the next few years. It's a very dire situation, and what's unfortunate is that the Christian church in general is so split that many other Christians do not regard the Orthodox as sufficiently Christian or do not regard us as being worthy of attention because they're concerned only about people within their own sect.
You became Orthodox recently.
Well, yeah, I was actually baptized Orthodox, grew up Orthodox, and left, unfortunately, the Orthodox Church quite a few years ago, but was a Melkite Greek Catholic, which enabled me to attend at the Divine Liturgy instead of the Roman Mass, and that kept alive, I think, my love for the Byzantine tradition, love for the Orthodox Church. And ultimately, a few years ago, yes, I returned, thank God, to the Orthodox Church. What happened was, of course, I mentioned a little bit earlier my experience within the Catholic Church, that the Catholic Church wants no part of the truth about Islam, does not want to speak about jihad or the persecution of Christians. And this kind of brought me up short. Not only, of course, it affected me personally because I was getting canceled everywhere, but it also made me think. And what it made me realize was that a lot of the claims about authority that were made within the Catholic Church were false, were not based on Scripture, were not based on holy tradition, were not ever something that we had seen in the early centuries of the Church, and that the early Church was actually constituted the way the Orthodox Church is to this day, with bishops and priests and the apostolic succession, but without one super bishop that had total authority over all the others. And so I was very grateful as a result of those investigations to return to the Orthodox Church.
Well, I know just as you are a hero to me, when I talked to Father Alex at the Archdiocese, he is a big fan of yours as well.
Well, it's mutual in both cases. Father Alex is a great man and doing great work for the Church in America and around the world. And very, very honored to know him. And I spoke a couple years ago at the annual retreat of the Archons of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. And of course, it was a tremendous honor for me, perhaps the most that I've ever had in terms of speaking anywhere. And I was very grateful to be able to lend a little bit of support to the Ecumenical Patriarchate. I hope to do more of that, quite a bit more of that in the future. And I'm also, as I told you, working on a book now that is an apologetic case for Orthodoxy.
Yeah, expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I hope to. I don't have a publisher yet. I hope that it'll get published, but...
it will.
Well, one of the main things that I'm doing in the book is actually challenging the claims for papal authority that are made by Catholics. And the reason why that's the focus is because of my personal experience when I made it known that I had left the Catholic Church and returned to Orthodoxy, I heard from quite a few Catholics, as a matter of fact, people I didn't actually know personally. But my email box for a while was flooded with people who were making theological and historical arguments for papal authority. And so I thought, well, it's really, I know that I present arguments all the time, for various, I make a case for all kinds of things all the time. It's what I do. And one of the things that I find most dispiriting, if not annoying, is when the case that I've made is completely ignored. That it doesn't even become part of the discussion about the issue at hand. And so I thought, out of respect for these people, and out of respect for my old friends, some of whom are Catholic apologists themselves, I should make my case and explain why I do believe that the early church that was constituted the way the Orthodox Church is now, as I said, and that the Orthodox Church is the fullest and truest embodiment of the Church of the New Testament. So I go through the early centuries of the Church in the book and show that not only do people not speak about the Pope the way there was a Pope, there was a Bishop of Rome, of course, but nobody spoke about him the way he's spoken about today. Nobody accorded him the kind of authority that he had today. Nobody even seemed to think that he should have that kind of authority. Even the popes did not make claims for themselves that are taken for granted by Catholics today. For example, Pope Gregory the Great, from 590 to 604, he heard that the Byzantine emperor had awarded St. John the Faster, the Patriarch of Constantinople, with the title Ecumenical Patriarch, which only meant that he was the patriarch of the city that was the capital of the empire, but it was translated into Latin as universal bishop, and Pope Gregory was upset by that, and he wrote to St. John the Faster saying, there is no universal bishop. You can't say that you're the universal bishop, which of course it wasn't being said in the sense that Pope Gregory understood it. But the point is that the popes themselves say that they're the universal bishops now. But you have one of the foremost of the popes saying there was no such thing in the 590s. And so what's changed? If this is supposed to be the embodiment of eternal truths, then nothing should have changed.
Of all the threats we face in Western civilization, where do you rank the threat of Islam?
Oh, I would say that it is probably the first. I know that's not a fashionable view nowadays, Hank, but and people will say, well, look, you look at Iran and it's nothing like the power of China or Russia, and so how can you say that? Well, I can say that because Islam has lasted 1,400 years, and because it has a staying power. Empires come and go. Great nations come and go. World powers come and go. As a matter of fact, Persia was one of the two great world powers in the 7th century when Islam arose, but nobody would say that it is a superpower today. And these things always ebb and flow and wax and wane. But where Islam has gone, with the exceptions of Spain and Israel, and very few other places, where Islam has gone, it has stayed. And it's not only stayed, but it has transformed the area such that all the traces, or all but a few traces, of the previous civilization are eradicated. And the area is thoroughly Islamized. And you can't say that about communist China. Maybe you'll be able to say it about it in a few hundred years, but Tibet is still very much different from the Han Chinese areas. And there are many, many other places in China, in Russia, where you can see that the power of their government is simply not the kind of power that Islam has shown over the centuries. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not very powerful, and certainly with technology being what it is today and the surveillance that is possible today, we could see stunning growth in the power of totalitarian states in the next few years, and that may come to us. But I think ultimately it's going to be Islam that we're going to be dealing with, that free people in general are going to be dealing with, whatever happens to the United States in the coming centuries.
You mentioned the Persian people. I had the opportunity to speak at the University of Tehran as well as their sociology university, Alamatebetaba, back in 2012, I believe it was. I found the Persian people to be the most hospitable people you could possibly imagine. I remember walking the streets of Tehran in the middle of the night. I was greeted by nothing but acts of kindness. The populace itself, from my personal experience, were very interested in American civilization and American cars. They were very, very eager to talk to me, just serendipitously. Having said that, I want you to give us some kind of a perspective of where the real threat lies. We hear so often that Iran is the greatest threat. But what about Saudi Arabia? You mentioned Turkey. Where's the real threat?
Well, Iran is a threat, yes. Saudi Arabia is a different kind of threat, but it's also a threat, even though it's an American ally, because it's spent billions on dawah, Islamic proselytizing, and spread its understanding of Islam, which is quite virulent and violent, all over the world. And I should also add, before we get too far away from it, that yes, the Persian people are wonderful. I actually wrote a book a few years back, The Complete Infidel's Guide to Iran, in which I argue that the Persian people, they deserve a much better government than the Iranian regime. And the Iranian regime is engaged in global adventurism and is funding terror groups around the world and is working as hard as it can to bring to fruition the chants of death to America and death to Israel that they engage in. But that by no means is something that the Persian people are behind. And I'm hoping that ultimately they will be able to overthrow that regime and establish a more humane government. Turkey is also a tremendous threat, much more than people realize. As I mentioned before, they've taken up the slack that the Saudis have left. As the Saudis have curtailed some of their activities on part of Islam, Turkey has stepped into the breach and has funded mosques all over the United States, mosques that teach hatred of Jews and Christians and the necessity to wage jihad, all the rest of it. And we're going to be hearing from those mosques.
Given who you are, would you travel to Saudi Arabia or Turkey?
No, probably not. I'd love to go to Turkey. My family is from there. My grandparents were born in Çeşme, which is on the west coast of Turkey, right there at the edge by the sea. It's a beach town. And I'd love to go there, and I'd love to go to Constantinople and go into the Hagia Sophia. But I think it's very possible that I could be arrested or killed being there, as there are many Islamic hardliners there, and they consider that what I'm doing is wrong to be speaking so honestly about the nature of Islam and its teachings. And so I wouldn't go, but would be nice.
How many death threats do you face?
Well, I'll tell you, I haven't had any for a while, which is nice, but I have had many in the past. The publishers thought one of them was funny, actually. When I published a biography of Muhammad in 2006, they put a quote from the website revivingislam.com that was about me on the cover. So I just grabbed a copy of the book here and says, "May Allah rip out his spine from his back and split his brains in two, and then put them both back, and then do it over and over again." And you'll say, wait a minute, that's not a death threat, that's a prayer, that's asking Allah to do it. But the reality is that the Quran says in chapter 9, verse 14, that Muslims should fight non-Muslims. It says, fight them, and Allah will punish them by your hands. And so the Muslims are the executors of the divine wrath. And so if somebody is calling for Allah to punish somebody, that's a call to Muslims to do harm to him themselves. In 2015, I was the co-sponsor of the Muhammad Cartoon Contest, which we mounted in Garland, Texas, Pamela Geller and I, in order to stand for the freedom of speech and to show that we would not give in to violent intimidation, such as the killing of the Charlie Hebdo cartoonists in January 2015. And ISIS attacked our event with the two Muslims who had come to the event. They pulled out their guns and they were shot in the parking lot. But if they had gotten in, then, well, we wouldn't be discussing this today. And then in 2017, I was speaking in Iceland, which I thought would be a very quiet thing. But the Icelandic press made a very big deal of it, painting me out to be a terrible villain, and ultimately a leftist, actually, a non-Muslim leftist, poisoned my drink in a restaurant, and I was very sick, spent the night in the hospital and was very sick for a while. And so I understand that you never know, and these things might happen. This is, it's certainly, the public discourse in the United States is heating up in a bad way, and the left is becoming increasingly accepting of violence against those whom it hates. So I don't have any illusions.
You see any possibility of turning back the clock, or do you think that we're over the edge?
I don't think we're going to turn back the clock without strife, without there being some large-scale open conflict, maybe even civil war. More and more people are starting to think that, and I think it could happen very quickly, that if the president is reelected in 2020, it's very possible that these people who have been absolutely hysterical and enraged for every second since November 2016, and if they see that their impeachment attempts fail, if they fail, and that everything else they have tried to do to discredit and destroy him fail, then they might lash out and refuse to accept the results of the election, riots. There were riots when he was first elected, when he was first inaugurated, and I think it's only going to be worse this time if he makes it back.
A final question, and that is, give us some kind of a sense of your forthcoming book in December, The Palestinian Delusion.
Yeah, I'm very excited about that one. It is a history of the Middle East peace process. Here again, I think this is the first book of its kind, like the history of Jihad. There's no other history of Jihad in the English language, and there's no other history of the Middle East peace process. I go through every one of the attempts to negotiate, and it's quite a story. There were things that surprised me as I was researching. For example, Anwar Sadat, who's hailed as a great champion of peace, he was not quite the good guy that people think, and he went to the negotiating table for reasons quite different from what most people assume. But I go through each one of the negotiations, the Camp David Accords and Oslo and the roadmap and all the rest of them, show what happened, what was proposed, why it failed, and give the real clue as to the real reason why no negotiated settlement is ever going to work in that context. And so people can find out the answers to those things in the book. It'll be out December 3rd.
Robert, you are a true hero of the faith, and I am honored to have you on the Hank Unplugged podcast.
Well, thank you so much, Hank, and likewise, I'm very honored to be here, and thank God that you're getting better and survived all that, and that we've been able to have this conversation.
I'm happy that you have as well, and for everyone listening in, I've made good on my promise to bring the most interesting, informative, inspirational people on the planet directly to you. Robert Spencer is one of those people. You can keep up with him on Jihad Watch on the web. You can find all of his books on the web at equip.org. If he's written it, we want to promote it. So give us a 5-star rating or review whenever you listen to the Hank Unplugged podcast. And if you love the podcast, let others know by sharing the podcast. And thank you so very much for tuning in to this edition of the Hank Unplugged podcast and increasing its popularity around the world. So long for now.